There are storms that fall like passing visitors, harmless and indifferent. And then there are storms that descend with a purpose, storms that feel as though the sky itself is searching for a single soul, strong enough to stand beneath its weight. On this day, the rain did not simply pour. It pressed against the earth with the aching intensity of something ancient trying to reach someone forgotten. And in the heart of Amahle village, where even the bravest had retreated indoors, a 16-year-old girl stood alone with her face lifted to the heavens, as if answering a call no one else had the courage to hear. The storm had begun long before the first drop touched the red earth. Hours earlier, a stillness had crept across the land, a quiet, suffocating hush that even the animals sensed. Birds had abandoned the sky. Goats pressed themselves into the corners of their shelters. The elders, who understood the language of shifting winds, whispered among themselves, troubled by the strange pulse beating through the air. They recognized that this was not a storm born of weather. It was a storm carrying meaning, and meaning always came for someone. Amahle felt that truth long before she could name it. She had lived her entire life with a quiet heart, moving through the world gently, carefully, almost invisibly. She was neither loud enough to be celebrated, nor rebellious enough to be remembered. People spoke over her softness, stepping past her presence as though she were a passing shadow instead of a living soul. Even in her grandmother's loving home, she often felt like a story waiting too long to be told. But today, as rainwater streamed down her braids and soaked into her skin, she felt something shift, something rising in her chest that did not belong to invisibility. The villagers watched her through narrow window slits, brows furrowed in confusion that slowly shaded into unease. A girl standing alone in a storm was strange. A girl standing willingly was unsettling. The thunder rolled across the sky in long, shaking waves, yet Amahle did not flinch. Mud swallowed her ankles. Her dress clung to her like a second skin, but she stood rooted as though the storm had anchored her to the earth itself. She was not waiting for the rain to stop. She was not waiting for someone to rescue her. She was waiting for something that existed beyond the borders of what she understood, something she had felt, whispering at the edges of her life for years. Every drop that struck her skin felt strangely alive, as if carrying unspoken messages meant only for her. She closed her eyes and let the rain fall where it wished, allowing its cold weight to settle across her shoulders, like an old, familiar truth. For the first time in her life, she did not try to shrink herself or step out of the way. Instead, she allowed herself to be seen by the sky, by the storm, by whatever force had come searching through the clouds for her. A soft ache stirred in her chest, the ache of someone who had spent years waiting for something she could not explain and fearing she would never find. And yet, beneath the sorrow, something else awakened. A quiet strength, trembling but undeniable. The wind shifted suddenly, cutting through the storm like a blade of silence. The rain, once wild and uncontrolled, began to fall with an eerie rhythm, as though something unseen was rearranging the storm around her. Amahle's breath froze in her throat as she felt a pressure at her back, not the touch of a hand or the shake of the wind, but a presence. It was subtle, almost gentle, yet powerful enough to make the air thicken around her. Her heart pounded, not in fear, but in recognition. Someone, or something, had stepped into the storm with her. She opened her eyes slowly, the world blurring through the waterfall of rain, and for a moment she wondered if she had imagined it. But then the thunder softened, rolling across the sky like a voice lowering itself to speak, and the hairs along her arms lifted in an electric shiver. The storm was no longer falling at her. It was falling around her, protecting her, listening to her. And that was when she felt it, felt the truth she had been unknowingly moving toward her entire life. She was not the only one standing on that path anymore. And just as the rain reached its heaviest, the storm shifted with an intelligence that was not its own. Something stepped forward through the curtain of falling water, unseen, but unmistakably watching her, as if the storm itself had delivered a visitor meant only for her eyes. Greatness often comes wrapped in silence, long before the world learns to recognize its shape, and Amahle's life had always unfolded in the quiet spaces no one bothered to notice. Yet destiny has a way of leaning toward the hearts others ignore, listening more carefully to the whispers of those who have spent years learning to survive without being seen. Amahle's childhood had been shaped by the gentle strength of her grandmother, Amahle, a woman whose hands bore the marks of seasons spent tending food, healing neighbors, and carrying the weight of a life far heavier than the frailness of her old age suggested. Their home, a small clay-walled hut at the edge of Amahle village, felt more like a refuge for forgotten stories than a dwelling for two souls. The air was always warm, with the scent of herbal tea simmering in a cracked clay pot, and the walls were lined with the woven baskets Amahle crafted with patient fingers that held memories more carefully than most people held dreams. Amahle had grown up in this gentle stillness, learning humility not through instruction, but through the simple rhythm of watching her grandmother live. While other children filled the marketplace with laughter and energy that stretched into every corner of the square, Amahle learned early to move softly, not from fear, but from a natural inclination toward quiet observation. She would slip between people, the way wind slipped between tall grass, present yet unnoticed, listening to their stories, memorizing their faces, carrying their burdens in a heart too young to understand the weight of compassion. Villagers often called her helpful, polite, or sweet, but their compliments faded as quickly as they were spoken. Once their need was met, once the water was fetched, the child soothed, or the errand completed, Amahle faded again into the background as though she were a temporary presence rather than someone with a world of her own. Her invisibility was not born of neglect, but of a culture that valued louder voices, stronger hands, and quicker tongues. Amahle's softness made her easy to overlook, and even easier to forget. She was the kind of girl people passed by, without realizing they had walked beside someone who silently memorized their pain. Someone who noticed the quiet tremble in their hands, the longing hidden behind their smiles, the tired heaviness in their steps. And because she carried those invisible pieces of others, she often had little room left to carry her own. She had dreams, of course, soft, flickering ones she held close to her chest, as though afraid the world would snap them in half if it ever saw them clearly. She dreamed of becoming someone whose voice mattered, someone whose presence shifted rooms the way storms shifted skies. She imagined moments where her name was spoken with warmth rather than forgetfulness, where people met her gaze long enough to see the depth behind it. But these dreams remained curled inside her, like sleeping birds, fragile and waiting, unsure if they would ever find wind strong enough to lift them. In the quiet evenings after her chores, Amahle would step outside their home and sit by the river's edge, letting her bare feet dangle in the cool water as the dying sun painted the horizon in amber. The river never asked her to speak. It simply existed beside her, reflecting her loneliness with gentle acceptance. When night crept across the sky, the stars became the only audience to her whispered hopes. Hopes she was too afraid to confess to Amahle. Hopes she feared were too big for a girl so invisible that even her laughter was often swallowed by the world before it reached anyone's ears. And then there was the rain, her most faithful companion. Rain never overlooked her. It greeted her with a tenderness that felt like recognition. Every storm felt like a mirror, reflecting a part of her the world refused to acknowledge. When droplets hit her skin, they felt like the sky weeping with her, or perhaps for her. She often found herself speaking into the downpour in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, releasing small pieces of her heart she could never scatter into human hands. Each prayer dissolved into the storm like an offering, carried by the wind to places she would never see, heard by forces she didn't fully understand. It was during those rain-soaked moments that she allowed herself to imagine possibilities larger than her life. She wondered what it would feel like to be seen, truly seen, and not dismissed as a shadow moving quietly behind the lives of others. She wondered what it would be like to step into a world shaped not by her invisibility, but by her presence. And though she had never expected an answer, she whispered anyway, hoping that if destiny ever passed near enough, it might pause to listen. She never imagined the sky was already listening. Not just the sky, but something moving beyond it, something waiting for the moment she would finally stand beneath a storm strong enough to reveal her worth. Something ancient, something deliberate. Something is coming. And as the storm thickened above Amahle village, the heavens gathered themselves with a strange, deliberate patience, as though preparing to respond to every whispered hope she had ever released into the rain, ready to send her a sign that would change more than her life, ready to change an entire nation. Some arrivals slip quietly into the world, yet their meaning roars louder than any storm that welcomes them. And on that trembling afternoon, as the sky cracked open above Amahle village, Amahle saw the silhouette of a man approaching her, long before she understood why the storm itself seemed to part for him. There was something unsettling in how the thunder softened at his steps, as though even the heavens recognized him. The rain fell in relentless sheets, blurring the world into streaks of gray, but the stranger's figure did not sway or falter. He walked with the steady composure of someone who had long made peace with storms, both those that rose from the sky and those that rose from life. His frame was slender yet grounded, his posture tall beneath the weight of a cloak darkened by travel and rain. His clothes clung to him, worn at the edges, marked by journeys across places Amahle could only imagine. Far mountains, wandering roads, perhaps even lands where people did not bow to storms, but welcomed them like old friends. Yet none of that hardship showed on his face. His expression carried a calm so deep, it felt almost unnatural within the chaos surrounding him. As he drew nearer, Amahle felt something shift inside her, an inexplicable stillness blooming where moments ago only longing had lived. It wasn't comfort, and it wasn't fear. It was recognition of a kind she could not name, as though her spirit had sensed him long before her eyes did. The storm, once roaring without mercy, seemed to soften around his presence, its fury retreating into a quieter rhythm. Even the wind changed direction, circling gently as if unsure how to behave around him. Amahle felt the strange warmth of calmness spreading through her chest, weaving itself into the uncertainty that had wrapped her all morning. He came to a slow halt, just a breath's distance from her, his gaze holding hers with a depth that made the world behind him dissolve into the blur of rainfall. He didn't look surprised to see her alone in the storm. He did not question her presence, her trembling hands, or her soaked dress clinging to her skin. Instead, he studied her with the quiet understanding of someone who had spent years observing human hearts, someone who knew the difference between loneliness and chosen solitude. The rain traced soft patterns down his face, but he did not lift a hand to wipe it away. He seemed more attuned to what moved inside Amahle than to what fell from the sky. "You wait for more than shelter," he said softly, his voice carrying a strange clarity that cut through the storm, as though each word was wrapped in its own light. There was no judgment in his tone, no curiosity disguised as concern, only certainty, a knowing that reached into the parts of her she had never shown to anyone. The sound of his voice felt like a memory she had forgotten, rather than a stranger's greeting. Amahle swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Her lips parted, but her voice remained caught somewhere between disbelief and confusion. How could a man she had never met understand her longing so easily? How could he see through her silence when no one else even noticed it? The storm pressed around them like a trembling veil, but Amahle felt as though she had stepped into a different world, one where someone finally looked at her without looking past her. He extended no hand, He offered no introduction. Yet the way he stood before her, steady, gentle, impossibly sure, made her feel as though she had been waiting for this moment, long before she ever realized she was waiting. His eyes, dark and calm, like deep river water, held a knowledge that both unsettled and anchored her. And then, as the thunder rolled across the distant hills, she saw something flicker in his gaze. Something that didn't belong to a traveler or a wanderer, something like recognition. The storm hovered between them, trembling with secrets it had carried across the sky, and Amahle felt her breath tighten as the stranger's eyes softened with a familiarity she could not understand. For in that fleeting moment, she realized this man had not found her by chance. He had come as though he already knew her name, her heart, and the destiny she had not yet glimpsed. Some truths enter a life the way lightning enters a storm, sudden, impossibly bright, cutting through everything familiar in one breathtaking strike. And as the stranger guided Amahle away from the heart of the downpour, she sensed that whatever truth he carried was not merely important. It was dangerous, life-altering, and impossibly tied to her in ways she had never dreamed possible. He led her beneath the rusted awning of an abandoned trading stall, its tin roof trembling beneath the rhythm of the rain. The storm eased there, not fully retreating, but softening into a mist that felt almost protective. The wooden table before them, once used for selling woven mats and hand-carved spoons, now stood like a silent witness to a moment destiny had been arranging long before the two of them were born. Amahle could feel her heartbeat echoing in her ears, pulsing with the same unease that flickered through the storm clouds overhead. The stranger took a slow breath, his eyes lifting to the horizon where the rain blurred the outline of distant hills. "This land," he began softly, "has been losing its unity for years, piece by piece, voice by voice, heart by heart." His tone carried no accusation, no anger, only a deep, almost mournful truth, as though he had walked through the fractures himself. People speak the same language, but no longer understand one another. They share the same land, but no longer share hope. A nation does not fall at once, Amahle. It fades, quietly, from the inside. Amahle stiffened, startled not just by his words, but by the way he spoke her name, firmly, clearly, without hesitation. She had not offered it. She had not spoken a single word of introduction, yet he carried it as though he had known it long before the storm began. Her breath wavered, and she instinctively stepped back, not out of fear, but out of the overwhelming sensation of being seen in a way she had never been seen before. The stranger's gaze followed her movement, calm and unwavering. "Change is coming," he continued, locking eyes with her in a way that made it impossible to look away. "But change does not begin with crowds or leaders. It begins with one heart, ready to be seen." The words sank deep, unsettling something inside her she had kept buried for years. Amahle had spent her whole life invisible, unnoticed, drifting quietly in the background of other people's lives. She had never imagined her existence could shape anything larger than the space she occupied. Yet the stranger spoke to her, as though she were the axis on which fate was ready to turn. He reached into the folds of his travel-worn cloak and withdrew a small carved token, shaped like a sun with 12 rays. The edges were smoothed by time, the center engraved with symbols she did not recognize, rainwater beads on its surface like gemstones. "I did not come here by chance," he said. "I have traveled far, across valleys, across villages, across nights where the stars whispered your image into my dreams." Amahle's throat tightened. "My image?" He nodded slowly, holding the token between them so she could see the faint engraving at its center. Even through the blur of rain, she recognized the likeness etched into the wood, braids like hers, eyes shaped like hers, and beneath it, a single word carved in careful strokes: Amahle. Her breath left her in a shudder. The world tilted slightly, the storm around them seeming to hold itself in place, suspended in a moment where reality felt suddenly fragile. "Why me?" she whispered, barely trusting her voice. "Because you were chosen long before you learned to fear your own light," he answered. "The storm led me to you. The vision carried your face, and the message I bear—" He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Belongs to no other soul but yours." The rain slowed to a hush, as if the sky itself leaned closer to hear the next words spoken between them. And in that unnatural stillness, with the storm holding its breath and the token glowing faintly between them, Amahle realized the sky was not merely raining. It was waiting. Waiting for the answer only she could give, and for the destiny that would rise the moment her voice broke the silence. Sometimes destiny does not thunder into a life with noise or fire. Sometimes it slips quietly into the hands of the one who never imagined she was meant to hold anything extraordinary. And as Amahle stood beneath the trembling roof of the abandoned awning, she felt the weight of something ancient settle over her, soft, delicate, yet powerful enough to change not only her world, but the world far beyond the borders of her village. The stranger studied her with the patience of someone who had followed signs across deserts and mountains, only to arrive at the very soul destiny had whispered into his dreams. Amahle could not understand what he saw in her. She had never been the girl people chose for anything grand. She was the one who fetched water quietly, the one who soothed crying children with gentle hands, the one who offered a listening ear to those who needed it but forgot her the moment their tears dried. Yet the stranger spoke as though her entire life had been shaped with deliberate intention, as though every moment she had spent unseen had been part of a larger tapestry she had never been allowed to step back far enough to recognize. "You possess a gift," he said, his voice steady and warm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who did not waste words. "Not a gift of power or loudness, but a gift far rarer. Your presence softens what is hardened, calms what is trembling, restores what is breaking." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the space between them. "There are hearts in this world that change landscapes, Amahle. Yours is one of them." Amahle felt her breath falter, the storm outside echoing the rise and fall of her uncertainty. She had always believed her kindness was ordinary, something anyone could offer if they remembered to look beyond themselves. But the stranger's gaze told her otherwise. He saw meaning in her silence, intention in her patience, strength in a gentleness she had never thought important enough to cherish. "Your humility has been preparing you," he continued softly. "Your quiet endurance, your ability to listen where others speak, your willingness to stand alone without bitterness. These are not accidents. They are pieces of a calling woven into you from the moment you were born." Her heart trembled at his words. She felt too small for such things, too unsure of herself, too ordinary in a world that often celebrated only those who shone loudly. The stranger sensed her doubt before she even spoke it. "Do not confuse being unseen with being unchosen," he said. "Some of the greatest lights begin their lives in shadows, not because they belong there, but because the world is not yet ready for their brightness." Amahle's chest tightened, a mix of fear and wonder swirling inside her, like the storm clouds gathering beyond the rooftops. She wanted to believe him, yet her uncertainty clung to her like the dampness of the rain-soaked dress wrapped around her legs. "Why would destiny choose me?" she whispered, her voice barely reaching above the soft hiss of the mist around them. "I am not strong. I am not brave. I am not enough." The stranger stepped closer, not with force or expectation, but with a reverence she had never seen directed at her. "Every soul chosen to carry light begins by believing they are unworthy of it," he murmured. "But worthiness is not decided by confidence. It is revealed through a heart that remains open even after it has been overlooked. That is where real strength lives, in those who keep offering warmth even when the world forgets to offer it back. Amahle lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the truth she felt rising inside her, despite her fear. The storm outside began to shift again, not fading, but gathering with an eerie anticipation, as though it understood that something within her was changing, unfolding, awakening in quiet defiance of her doubts. Her fingers brushed the carved sun token he had placed in her hand, the wooden rays warm despite the cold rain around them. She did not know what path awaited her. She did not know how her small life could possibly hold anything large enough to touch a nation. But she felt the first fragile spark of courage flicker through her, not loud, not certain, but real, and the storm seemed to bow to it. For as the wind shifted and the rain softened into a thin silver veil, Amahle realized that her fear was no longer the loudest voice inside her. Something deeper was rising, something steady, something meant. And destiny, patient and watchful, waited in the quiet space between her breath and her answer. Every great journey begins not with certainty, but with trembling steps taken in the direction of an unknown future. And as the first breath of dawn slipped across Amahle village, Amahle stepped into that pale morning light, carrying more questions than strength, more fear than faith. Yet something deep within her insisted the path ahead was one she had been born to walk. The village behind her was still wrapped in sleep, the clay houses quiet beneath the soft blush of sunrise. Smoke rose lazily from early cooking fires like gentle farewells from a world that had shaped her, held her, and unknowingly kept her small. The stranger walked ahead with quiet confidence, guiding her along a narrow path carved by years of wandering feet. Amahle followed him, her steps hesitant at first, then steadier as the rhythm of the earth beneath her feet settled into her bones. Leaving her home felt like peeling away a part of herself, yet she sensed that staying would have trapped her in a silence too heavy for her spirit to carry much longer. As they journeyed beyond the familiar outlines of Amahle, Amahle was introduced to a world far wider and far more wounded than she had imagined. They passed through villages where roofs sagged beneath neglect and where children's laughter had faded into thin echoes of a joy long forgotten. Elderly women sat outside their homes with tired eyes that held stories no one had bothered to hear. Young men worked fields with shoulders bent not only under the weight of labor, but under the burden of hopelessness. The air held a heaviness that clung to the skin like dust, a heaviness born of grief, hunger, and exhaustion woven into the daily rhythm of life. With every step, Amahle's heart expanded in ways she did not understand. Faces she had never seen felt strangely familiar, as though their pain had been calling her long before she knew to listen. Children approached her shyly at first, drawn by something gentle in her gaze, and when she knelt beside them, the tiredness in their eyes seemed to ease. Elders spoke to her with a respect that surprised her, as though they sensed a quiet presence she herself had never recognized. She didn't speak grand words or offer promises of change. She simply listened, deeply, patiently, without rushing, and people felt seen in a way they hadn't felt in years. It was strange how her presence softened even the hardest expressions. A man who had not smiled in months found himself chuckling when she praised the carvings he thought no one noticed. A grieving mother took her hand and cried without shame, comforted by the silence Amahle shared with her. A group of restless boys, tense with frustration at the brokenness around them, relaxed for the first time as Amahle's calm steadiness settled into the air. She was not doing anything extraordinary, yet something extraordinary was happening through her. The stranger observed from a distance, his eyes carrying the calm of someone who had expected this awakening, but remained humbled by witnessing it. He did not interrupt. He did not guide her in these moments. He let her discover what he already knew, that her gift was not a skill to be taught, but a light that had always lived quietly inside her, waiting for the world to call it forward. The more Amahle walked, the more she felt a shift in the people around her. At first, they watched her with the curiosity reserved for strangers. Then, slowly, a few began to follow. A weary mother carrying a child trailed behind for a few steps. An elder leaned on his staff and joined the path, as though her footsteps held a rhythm his spirit recognized. Young men with hollow eyes walked at a distance, silently, choosing to trust the direction she moved toward. And with each village they passed, the trail of quiet followers grew, not out of desperation, but out of a fragile hope that had not yet dared to leave them. Amahle felt the weight of their presence, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. She had left her village believing she was stepping into uncertainty, yet she now sensed that she was stepping into purpose. Her heart trembled with the enormity of it, but she did not turn back. She knew the world behind her had nothing more to teach her. The world ahead, however, whispered invitations she could no longer ignore. By midday, the small group behind her had doubled. By dusk, even the air carried a different energy, an expectant hush, a stirring of something being born in the spaces between her steps. And as night fell and the stars gathered silently overhead, Amahle noticed the crowd behind her growing with each passing hour. They were no longer just following her path. They were following her. And deep in her chest, a question rose with trembling force. How far would they follow? And what would she become by the time they reached where destiny was leading them? Some voices begin their lives as fragile whispers, barely strong enough to reach the person who speaks them. Yet when the moment of truth arrives, when the world leans in, hungry for someone to remind it what it once believed, those same whispers rise with a strength that can steady the trembling of nations. And Amahle's voice, quiet for most of her life, found its power at the exact moment destiny demanded to hear it. The town they entered that morning bore the unmistakable marks of grief. Homes stood half-mended, their walls patched with whatever scraps people could find. The marketplace lay quiet, stalls abandoned or sparsely filled, as though laughter itself had forgotten the road that led there. Faces carried the heaviness of recent sorrow, eyes dim, shoulders bent, spirits thinned by loss that words could not easily hold. Even the air felt muted, as if afraid to stir the memories that clung to every corner of the streets. Amahle felt the ache of this place settle inside her, with a weight that pressed against her ribs. A small group had gathered in the center of the square, drawn by travelers who whispered that a girl with a strange, quiet light was walking across villages. Though Amahle did not see herself that way, the people saw something she overlooked, a gentleness that did not pity, a stillness that did not judge, a presence that asked for nothing, yet offered everything she had without realizing she was giving. The stranger standing beside her watched the gathering crowd with a knowing expression, as though waiting for a moment he had predicted long ago. But Amahle's hands trembled softly. She had not come to speak. She had come to listen. She had come because her heart could not turn away from suffering. But the people needed a voice, and the wind sensed it. Before she did, an elder woman, wrapped in a faded shawl, stepped forward and faced Amahle with trembling hope. "Child," she whispered, "say something. Anything. We have forgotten what it feels like to believe." The words were not a command. They were a plea, a reaching, a fragile request wrapped in desperation. Amahle felt her breath catch. She had no speeches prepared, no wisdom rehearsed. She had never stood before a crowd in her life. Yet every face lifted toward her, waiting, longing, clinging to the possibility that she carried more than silence. Amahle stepped forward slowly, her heart pounding with the rhythm of uncertainty. The stranger did not encourage her or guide her. He simply watched, trusting she would find what had always lived inside her. Amahle closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the warmth of the wind brush her cheeks, as though inviting her to speak. Not loudly, not boldly, but truthfully. When she opened her eyes again, she lifted her chin, not with pride, but with purpose. "I cannot promise to solve your struggles," she began, her voice soft yet strangely steady. "I cannot erase your grief or mend every broken piece of your lives. But I can remind you of something you have not lost." A hush settled across the square. "You have each other. You have strength woven into your bones from generations of surviving storms far worse than this one. You have a dignity that hardship cannot steal, a unity that silence alone cannot break." Her words flowed not from knowledge, but from sincerity. Genuine, unforced, warm. "You are not alone," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Your pain is shared. Your burdens are seen. And your hearts, though tired, are still beating with the courage that built this land long before any of us were born." People listened with a stillness that felt sacred, as though her voice awakened memories they had buried out of necessity. Memories of community, of resilience, of belonging. Amahle did not speak loudly, but something in her tone carried the weight of a truth many had forgotten how to name. She spoke of unity not as a dream, but as a heritage. She spoke of hope not as an escape, but as a duty they owed themselves. She spoke of humanity not as weakness, but as the deepest strength a people could hold. As her final words drifted into the air, a quiet warmth spread through the crowd, a warmth that softened faces, straightened tired shoulders, and lifted chins that had long been too heavy to raise. It was not a miracle. It was recognition, a remembering, a return. Travelers carried her words with them as they left the town. Mothers repeated them to their children. Elders murmured them like prayers. And by dusk, Amahle's message had slipped into the wind, carried toward villages she had not yet reached. And somewhere far beyond that grieving square, hope, long dormant, long silent, long forgotten, stirred like the first glow of dawn rising behind. The hills, waiting for the moment it would burst fully into light. When hope rises in one corner of a land, it rarely stays contained within the borders that first embraced it. It moves like wind, quiet, steady, unstoppable, carrying whispers of possibility into places that have forgotten what belief feels like. And Amahle's light, once a small flame flickering within her quiet spirit, began traveling faster than footsteps, reaching the ears and hearts of people she had never met. It started with travelers who returned home from distant markets, speaking of a young girl whose gentle presence could still the unrest stirring in weary souls. They described her as soft-spoken, yet strangely powerful, humble yet impossible to overlook once she had spoken even a single sentence. Word spread from village to village, passed between farmers preparing fields at dawn, between women weaving baskets under shade trees, between elders who sat outside their homes like sentinels watching over memory. People leaned into these stories because something inside them recognized the truth. The land had been starving for a voice that reminded them of who they had been before fear reshaped their hearts. Soon, crowds began to gather wherever Amahle walked. Some traveled miles under scorching sun, just to see the girl whose quiet presence had begun to mend the fractures in a nation's spirit. Others came carrying burdens they had held for years, grief unspoken, anger unhealed, dreams abandoned. Yet when they reached her, they found that Amahle did not offer grand speeches or perfect solutions. She offered something far rarer: human sincerity. Her eyes held a warmth that softened even the harshest memories, and her words, simple, gentle, unforced, reminded people of the dignity they feared they had lost. In villages once divided by bitterness, she sat between groups who had avoided each other for seasons, guiding them back into conversation not through authority, but through compassion. She listened more than she spoke, and somehow, in her listening, old wounds found space to loosen their grip. Farmers returned to shared fields. Families separated by anger found their way back to a single table. Even the restless youth, who had grown tired of promises from leaders who never delivered, found solace in Amahle's unwavering humility. She did not claim power. She did not chase honor. She simply stood with an open heart, and people remembered themselves through her. Communities once fractured by distrust began rebuilding their gatherings around her message. Women revived traditional dances long forgotten, moving with renewed pride beneath the evening sky. Elders dusted off ancient teachings and told them to young children who listened with newfound curiosity. Men returned to long-abandoned projects, building with hands strengthened by a purpose they thought had vanished. Joy, once a rumor, became a visitor again. Unity, once an echo, began to take shape. The stranger, who had discovered her, watched all of this with a calm satisfaction, though his gaze sometimes drifted toward the horizon with a shadowed understanding. He knew that when a light grows this bright, it cannot avoid drawing the attention of forces that prefer the world dim. He knew Amahle's rising influence, though beautiful, would soon test her in ways she had not yet imagined. But Amahle noticed none of this. She moved through each village with a humility that disarmed those who met her. She never asked for the crowds. She never claimed to lead. She simply offered her heart where it was needed, and people found themselves rising to meet the hope she inspired. The nation, once sinking quietly into despair, now stood on its toes, reaching for her glow like sunflowers turning toward morning. And yet, in the spaces just beyond the laughter and renewed unity, something else was beginning to stir. Something not moved by her gentleness, not softened by her compassion, not pleased by the awakening she brought. For as Amahle's light spread across the land, shadows that had long waited at the edges of the nation began to shift, watching her rise with silent intent, because wherever light grows strong, darkness grows curious. When the world leans too heavily upon a single heart, even the brightest light begins to tremble beneath the weight it never asked to bear. And as Amahle moved from village to village with her quiet, steady grace, she began to feel the gentle but relentless pressure of a nation placing its hope, its healing, and its brokenness into her hands, hands that had never been taught how to hold such magnitude. The early days of her journey had felt manageable, almost gentle in their demands. People sought comfort, not miracles, presence, not power. But as her name echoed farther across the land, the crowds grew, not gradually, but with a swelling urgency that startled even her. Where once a few dozen villagers gathered to hear her speak, now hundreds waited under scorching sun or chilling dusk, their faces fragile with expectation. They carried stories of heartbreak folded beneath their ribs, stories she could feel before they were spoken. Her compassion became a river pouring endlessly from her spirit. But even rivers run shallow if never allowed to rest. She visited hospitals where weary nurses fought exhaustion to keep hope alive, in rooms filled with thin cries and trembling breaths. She spoke softly to children lying beneath thin blankets, offering them not promises, but warmth. She listened to elders whose memories had grown sharp with regret and dull with age, and something in her presence softened the bitterness they had carried for too long. In forgotten schools, she knelt on cracked floors beside teachers who refused to abandon their students, despite empty shelves and fading chalkboards. Her words rekindled their faith in the small moments that shaped lives quietly and permanently. She traveled to communities abandoned by leaders who had long grown distant from the people they claimed to serve. There, Amahle sat among them, not above, never above, and reminded them that unity could begin again with a single shared breath. She held the trembling hands of farmers who feared another failed harvest. She wept silently with mothers who had learned to carry grief like a second heartbeat. She listened to frustrated youth who felt trapped between survival and dreams too big for the world around them. And everywhere she went, the same thing happened. People found strength again, not because she told them how to find it, but because she allowed them to see their own reflection in her humility. She became the mirror through which they rediscovered pieces of themselves they thought time had swallowed. But with every heart she revived, a fragile exhaustion began to creep into Amahle's own spirit. She gave freely, naturally, instinctively, but she had never learned how to replenish what she poured out. At night, when the crowds finally quieted and the stars hung above like silent witnesses, she felt the hollowness spreading gently through her chest. Not darkness, not despair, just a tiredness too deep for words. The stranger watched all of this with an expression carved from equal parts pride and concern. He walked beside her, always present yet never intrusive, observing the gradual dimming of the spark he had once seen, fiercely alive. He knew what it meant to carry a calling larger than one's own strength. He knew the cost of becoming hope for those who have forgotten their own. But he also knew something Amahle did not: that light cannot travel forever if it forgets the flame from which it first emerged. He waited, quietly, for the moment she would need to return to her roots. People began to notice the faint weariness in Amahle's eyes, though she masked it well. They came to her with deeper desperation, questions she could not answer, expectations she could not meet, sorrow she could not erase. She feared disappointing them. She feared failing them. She feared letting the light slip through her fingers when they needed it most. Every time she closed her eyes, the faces of thousands followed her into sleep. Yet she kept walking. Keep giving, keep trying. Until one late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in bruised shades of gold and violet, a messenger approached. Breathless, dust-covered, eyes wide with urgency. He carried a letter sealed in deep crimson wax, a symbol Amahle recognized not from memory, but from instinct, as though her spirit had always known it would find her one day. She felt her heart falter before she even touched it, for as her trembling fingers broke the seal, Amahle sensed the ground beneath her destiny shift, because whatever message waited inside those folded pages carried a truth powerful enough to shake her more deeply than any storm she had ever stood beneath. Sometimes, destiny sends a soul out into the wide and wounded world only so it can return, carrying the strength it once believed it lacked. And on the day the clouds gathered again in the sky above Amahle village, shaping themselves into the same heavy curtain of rain that had witnessed her earliest ache, Amahle felt the unmistakable pull of a call she could no longer ignore, one woven not from duty, but from the deepest threads of love and origin. The journey back home felt longer than any distance she had crossed in the months since her life had shifted from silence into purpose. Villagers from every region had begged her to stay, to speak once more, to give them even a fragment of the calm she carried. But the letter pressed to her chest thrummed with a weight she could not resist. Her grandmother, her only surviving family, the woman who had raised her with weathered hands and unwavering tenderness, had fallen gravely ill. The realization struck her with a force that hollowed her breath and tightened her heartbeat, reminding her that even a calling as large as a nation could not overshadow the roots that first shaped her. As Amahle neared her village, the landscape began to shift into memories she had once carried like shadows. The trees looked smaller, the hills gentler, the red dirt paths as familiar as breath. Yet everything felt washed in a new light, one that revealed what she had been too young, too hurt, too invisible to see before. This land had held her long before the world knew her name, had sheltered her tears, her silence, her longing. And now it waited with an ache of its own, as if it, too, had been listening for her return. By the time she reached the outskirts, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, soft, hesitant, almost reverent. They slid down her cheeks like the memory of a moment she had spent standing in another storm, on another path, believing she was unseen by the world. But this rain did not feel heavy with loneliness. It felt like recognition, like the sky remembering the girl who had once stood beneath it, waiting for a sign her life still mattered. The deeper she walked into the village, the harder the rain fell, until the entire landscape blurred beneath the silver sheets pouring from the darkened clouds. And with every step, Amahle felt guilt and fear twist themselves into a knot beneath her ribs. She wondered if she had left too soon, if she had given too much of herself to strangers, and not enough to the woman who had been her anchor when she had nothing else. She wondered if her grandmother had suffered alone. She wondered if her calling had blinded her to the one heart she should have guarded more closely than all the rest. Her home came into view, small, weathered, leaning slightly to one side, as though bowing beneath the weight of time. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The carved wooden door her grandmother had polished for years stood half open, trembling lightly in the shifting wind. Amahle's pulse quickened, an icy fear rippling through her as she hurried toward it, her feet slipping in the mud yet refusing to slow. But something stopped her just inches before she crossed the threshold. It was the rhythm of the rain, steady, insistent, almost musical. The exact rhythm she had heard on the day the stranger found her. The same pattern that had followed her throughout her journey. It was as if the storm itself had returned to remind her of the truth she had unknowingly carried across the nation. That her strength had not begun in the crowds, or the speeches, or the hope she had sparked in distant places. It had begun here, in this village that had overlooked her, in the silence she had once mistaken for insignificance, in the rain that had always known her heart, even when people did not. She closed her eyes and let the storm wash over her, not in fear this time, but in understanding. The rain was not demanding her return. It was welcoming it, not as the girl who once felt forgotten, but as the woman who had learned her worth. The moment she stepped inside, something shifted in her spirit, something quiet, something undeniable. For beneath that familiar rain, as her heart steadied and her breath deepened, Amahle felt clarity rise within her, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and she knew the truth waiting inside, that small house would change her path once again. Healing a nation does not begin with grand gestures or mighty declarations. It begins by touching the place that first whispered your name into the world. And as Amahle stepped back into Amahle, she sensed that her return was not a retreat from destiny, but a rediscovery of the foundation that had carried her farther than she ever realized. Amahle spent the first hours of dawn moving through her village with a quiet grace that brought comfort, simply by being present. Word had already spread of her arrival, and soon doorways filled with familiar faces, some surprised, some relieved, some still carrying unspoken apologies they did not know how to voice. But Amahle did not come home seeking admiration or answers. She came seeking reconnection, the simple truth of belonging that had once felt so far from her reach. She found herself speaking to her people not as a figure others traveled to see, not as a symbol shaped by distant towns, but as the girl they had once overlooked and now finally recognized. She stood among them with humility wrapped around her like a second skin, and the villagers listened with a softness that only comes when hearts finally understand the weight of what they almost lost. Her words did not rise like thunder. They flowed like steady water, restoring dry places in spirits worn thin by hardship. She spoke of unity, but she spoke even more of the courage required to forgive, to rebuild, to see one another again after years of silence. And something in the air shifted as she spoke, as if the village itself exhaled for the first time in years. Children gathered closer. Elders nodded with a reverence that came from wisdom rather than pride, and Amahle felt the ground beneath her feet recognize her presence in a way it never had before. It was as though the very soil remembered that she had grown from it, and now it offered its strength back to her, without hesitation. Yet the deepest pull of her return waited inside her small home, where her grandmother lay resting with breaths that wavered like fragile threads through the air. Amahle tended to her with a tenderness that came from a lifetime of quiet love, a love that had shaped her resilience long before the world ever saw it. She prepared warm cloths, whispered prayers in the language her grandmother taught her, and held her hand through the long, quiet hours of nightfall. With every gesture, Amahle felt her heart anchor itself more firmly than it ever had during the months she spent traveling. Here, in the soft lamplight beside the woman who had raised her, she rediscovered the root of her strength, not in crowds, not in speeches, but in the simple act of caring for the life that had once cared for hers. As days passed, Amahle began transforming around her, not through miracles or promises, but through the renewed spirit that grew from her presence. People repaired broken fences together, reopened wells, shared harvests with struggling neighbors, and rekindled traditions they had abandoned in years of hardship. It was subtle, almost invisible at first, but Amahle felt it in the way the village walked lighter, in the way laughter began returning to the air, in the way the land seemed to grow brighter, even under the same sky. Her light, she realized, did not shine because she stood before crowds. It shone because she stood rooted in the truth of who she was and where she came from. One morning, as the horizon softened into shades of lavender and gold, Amahle stepped outside to breathe the crisp dawn air. The village was still, wrapped in the fragile silence that comes just before light fully claims the world. She felt a calm she had not known in months, a calm that held no fear of failing others, no pressure to lift burdens too heavy for one soul. This calm came from alignment, from belonging, from understanding that her purpose and her origins were not separate threads but one continuous fabric. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the last thin veil of morning haze, something unexpected shimmered in the air. Something gentle, something bright, something that felt like acknowledgement from a realm far beyond sight. For in that rising dawn, as the world warmed around her, Amahle realized she was no longer alone. Something miraculous had awakened in answer to her return, waiting just beyond the light to reveal itself. Some become leaders through power, others rise through force, but the rarest among them lead simply by existing, by embodying a light that stirs something sleeping within an entire people. And as the storm clouds lifted over Amahle that morning, the nation began to understand that Amahle had never been chosen for her strength alone, but because she carried the kind of warmth that could turn even the coldest rain into a promise of brighter days. The sunlight broke through the clouds with a brilliance that felt almost ceremonial, spilling gold across the rooftops and pooling softly along the pathways where villagers stood, gathered in quiet awe. It was not the harsh heat of midday, nor the pale glow of early dawn. It was a radiant warmth that seemed to rise in response to Amahle's presence, as though the sky itself had long been waiting for her return, to release the blessing it held. Amahle stepped into the light, slowly, letting it touch her face with the same gentleness she had offered the world, and for a moment she simply breathed, feeling the sun settle over her shoulders, like an embrace she had earned through every tear, every fear, every choice rooted in compassion. News of her homecoming spread far beyond Amahle, traveling through markets, river paths, and distant hills faster than any messenger could carry it. Soon travelers began to appear, arriving on foot, by donkey, and in caravans woven with colorful cloth from neighboring regions. Some came seeking guidance, some came seeking healing for wounds no medicine could touch, and others came simply to witness the girl whose voice had softened conflicts and whose presence had rekindled unity in places long swallowed by division. They stepped into the village with reverence, humbled not by her age, but by the quiet dignity that radiated from her like a soft halo. Amahle greeted each person with the same gentle sincerity, listening more than she spoke, offering comfort without needing to command attention. Her compassion made her unforgettable. There was no throne beneath her, no crown upon her head, yet leaders found themselves bowing their pride to sit at her side. Chiefs consulted her before major decisions, elders traveled miles for her counsel, and teachers reshaped their lessons around the values she embodied. Her guidance did not come wrapped in authority. It emerged from truth so simple and pure that it dissolved conflicts before they had the chance to grow into wars. Where once there were divisions carved by fear, people now found common ground carved by hope. Communities that had long lived in the shadow of abandonment began to rebuild their foundations around her message of unity. Villages shared harvests instead of guarding them with suspicion. Youth groups formed to bring aid to forgotten regions. Mothers whose hearts had cracked beneath years of grief found new strength through Amahle's example. Even the land itself seemed to respond. Fields grew greener, rivers ran clearer, and music returned to the evenings as drums echoed once more through places that had fallen silent. Her influence wasn't loud or forceful. It was like sunlight at dawn, slow and steady, yet powerful enough to awaken an entire nation from a long, cold night. What made Amahle extraordinary was not that she transformed the nation, but that she reminded the nation how to transform itself. She became the symbol of a renewal no one had known they were waiting for. The child once forgotten in the rain had become the mirror through which people rediscovered their own capacity for kindness, courage, and unity. Her footsteps carried the softness of someone who understood pain, but chose light anyway, and the land followed her rhythm with a loyalty born from gratitude. And still, despite the attention, the praise, the endless stream of requests and blessings, Amahle remained unchanged, humble, grounded, rooted in the place that first whispered her destiny. She did not seek the spotlight that now wrapped itself around her. She simply walked in the warmth of a purpose she had learned to embrace without fear. And as the nation stood beneath the sunlight she inspired, they finally understood the truth the storm had tried to reveal. The girl who once waited unnoticed in the rain had become the guiding light, capable of lifting them all. If Amahle's journey touched your heart, then stay with us as we uncover more stories that awaken hope, courage, and purpose within us all. Your likes and comments help these powerful African tales reach the people who need their light the most. Subscribe and walk this path with us. Every new episode carries a lesson that might change someone's life, maybe even your own. Let this community grow into a place where compassion becomes our greatest strength.